Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Anita Lorraine Cobby was the kind of person who just left an impression on you, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she was genuinely kind. She was born on the 2nd of November, 1959, to Grace and Gary. And although she came into the world in Sydney, Australia, most of her childhood was spent in a suburb about 40 kilometers away called Blacktown. Now, if you've heard of Blacktown, you probably know it's got a bit of a reputation. The crime rates there, especially among younger people, were noticeably higher than average. We're talking robberies, break-ins, drug charges, that kind of stuff. But it's important to say that lifestyle wasn't everywhere. A lot of it was isolated to certain circles. And if you stayed out of that world, chances were it stayed out of yours too. There were nicer parts of Blacktown, and that's where Anita grew up. She wasn't alone. Anita had a younger sister named Catherine, and honestly, Catherine absolutely adored her. She was like Anita's little shadow, always copying her, always wanting to be just like her, and Anita loved her right back. They weren't just sisters, they were best friends. The kind that would go shopping in the city together, laugh over expensive shoes, and spend hours wandering through stores. Catherine once joked that Anita had a taste for the finer things. She loved the glam, but more than that, she just loved being with her sister. Everyone who knew Anita spoke about her in the same way. She was beautiful not just outside, but inside too. Warm, compassionate, empathetic. But there was one thing people remember most about her, and it's something I really love. Anita was a listener, a real listener. When you were talking to her, it felt like you were the only person in the world. She would lean in, rest her chin on her hand, look you right in the eyes, and just listen. Not half listening, not waiting for her turn to talk, just fully, deeply present with you. And I think that says a lot about the kind of soul she was. It's something so subtle, but so rare. Something that made people feel seen. And that's a beautiful legacy to leave behind. Anita Cobby had this deep love for music, the kind of love that defined entire phases of her life. Being a young woman in the 1980s, she was all about the iconic bands of that era. She adored the Eurythmics, the Police, Simply Red, that soulful, catchy, emotional kind of music. There's actually this one song, Holding Back the Years by Simply Red, that really stuck with the people who knew her. Her sister-in-law once said that every time she hears that song playing in a shop or on the radio, it just hits. That was Anita's song. It brings tears to her eyes because somehow that song is Anita. That's the kind of emotional imprint she left behind. But if there's one thing the media and sadly the case itself often fixates on, it's Anita's looks. And to be fair, she was stunning. The kind of beauty that turned heads without her even trying. Big, voluminous 80s curls, perfectly put together outfits. There was this quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Not arrogant, but self-assured. She took pride in her appearance, and she looked amazing always. In her late teens and early 20s, she entered a few beauty pageants, and she actually won some of them. A lot of people told her she should go into modeling. She had the kind of face and presence that could have made her a star in that world. But that wasn't her. Not really. And I think that says something powerful about who she was underneath all that surface beauty. Anita could have gone down the glamorous path, magazine covers, runways, all of it. But her heart wasn't in that. She didn't want a life that was just about being seen. She wanted a life that meant something, that helped people. She was incredibly compassionate, nurturing the kind of person who felt deeply for others. And it was that side of her, not the pageant winner or the 80s fashion icon, that really defined who Anita was. Her role model in that sense was her mother, Grace, who worked as a nurse. Anita looked up to her so much, and when the time came to choose a career path, she didn't think twice. She followed in her mother's footsteps and started training to become a nurse too. After deciding to follow in her mother's footsteps, Anita went off to get her nursing degree. Once her studies were underway, she started training at a local hospital, learning the ropes, working long hours, trying to make a difference, one patient at a time. And it was there, in the halls of that hospital, that she met someone who would completely change the course of her life. His name was John Cobby. He was a few years older than Anita, 23 to her 20, and he'd already been at the hospital for a while as a trainee nurse himself. When Anita joined, John ended up being the one who showed her around, helped her settle in, and pretty quickly, he fell for her. Hard. They were opposites in a way that just worked. John was loud, cheeky, the life of the party, always cracking jokes, pulling harmless pranks on people, just one of those magnetic personalities. Anita, on the other hand, had a much calmer presence. She was steady, grounded, but somehow, instead of clashing, they balanced each other out. Anita gave John this calming, centering energy, while John brought Anita out of her shell and helped her feel more confident and adventurous. And I think that's one of the most beautiful kinds of relationships, where you meet someone who brings you back to yourself while also pulling out the sides of you that you didn't even know were waiting to be seen. When John first saw Anita, he was stunned. He thought she was completely out of his league. At the time, he even had a girlfriend, but once he met Anita, things started to shift. He couldn't stop thinking about her. And as it turns out, Anita was feeling the same. They bumped into each other in the hospital corridor one day, and Anita was the one who made the first move. She started a conversation, nothing dramatic, just a simple interaction. But for John, it was everything. It gave him the courage to ask her out. Their first dinner date went on for hours, just talking, laughing, connecting. The next night, they did it again. And after that, they just clicked. It was one of those natural, easy, almost cinematic beginnings to a relationship. From colleagues to companions, it didn't take long for things to turn into something serious. What's really sweet is that while John was thinking, there's no way a woman like Anita could love someone like me, Anita was over here thinking the exact same thing. She thought he was the one out of her league, so laid back, so effortlessly fun, and in her eyes, incredibly handsome. They were both in awe of each other, and it just made their connection even more special. From everything I've read about them, one thing everyone seems to say is how happy they were together. Like truly. Their family said they just radiated joy. You could feel it when they walked into a room. They started dating in 1980, and just a year later, in 1981, John proposed. He said he'd fallen so hard for Anita that he couldn't imagine doing the rest of life without her. And so, in 1982, they got married. Anita Lynch officially became Anita Cobby. Not long after the wedding, Anita found out she was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it was welcomed. They were young, they were in love, and this just felt like the beginning of something big. They started imagining a future with a baby, started dreaming together. But sadly, just 9 weeks later, Anita miscarried. It hit them hard. As sudden as the pregnancy had been, they'd already wrapped their hearts around the idea of becoming parents. And now, just like that, it was gone. But they leaned on each other like they always did and said, one day, when we're ready, we'll try again. For now, they would just enjoy their 20s, make memories, and take life as it came. They ended up getting 2 dogs, and honestly, they spoiled them like they were kids. They'd take them everywhere, even out on boat rides. Sailing was something they both loved to do. And at one point, John actually won a fair amount of money betting on horse races. And instead of spending it on himself, he thought about Anita. Traveling the world had always been her dream, especially going to Rome. She used to say that Rome was the most romantic place on earth. So, with that winnings, John made it happen. They packed their bags and went traveling for a full year. Just the two of them, living life, seeing the world, loving every second of it. And when they came back, John was feeling ready. He sat Anita down and said, I think it's time. I think we're ready to try again, ready to start a family. But Anita wasn't quite there yet. By this point in her life, Anita was really just living. She was in her mid-20s, still young, still curious, and she was soaking it all in. She'd been traveling, seeing the world, hanging out with friends, making memories that didn't involve routines or responsibilities. And honestly, she wasn't ready to give that up just yet. She loved her life, the freedom, the spontaneity, the feeling that anything was still possible. And I think in some way, the idea of settling down with a child, with a house, with all the strings attached, felt like it might close a chapter she wasn't quite finished writing yet. That shift started to put pressure on her relationship with John. It wasn't just about the baby, though. There were a few different things building up between them. Things that maybe weren't even fully understood by either of them, just a sense that they weren't totally in sync anymore. So in 1986, after nearly 3 years of marriage, Anita and John made a decision. They needed some time apart. Not a breakup, not a divorce, just space to breathe, to figure out where they were, what they wanted, and whether they still wanted it together. No one outside the relationship really knew exactly what was going on, and that's the thing with love, right? From the outside, everything can look picture perfect, but behind closed doors, it can be a whole different story. At this point, Anita's mind was turning toward new things. She was thinking of going back to school, maybe getting another degree. She wanted to take Spanish classes, explore new possibilities. She was still in that becoming phase, figuring out who she was on her own, outside of a marriage or a family. So for now, she packed up her things and moved back to Blacktown. She'd been living in Sydney while working at the hospital with John, but for this short break, she went back to her parents' house. The plan was simple, 6 weeks apart, time to think, time to reset. Maybe even time to miss each other. During this time apart, Anita was still working as a nurse, still helping people, still showing up for her patients every single day. But outside of work, she was focusing on herself. And honestly, it felt like she was just beginning to bloom again. She had a great group of friends, a strong, supportive family, and she was starting to think about her dreams again. She'd been thinking about enrolling in an arts degree, something that always tugged at her curiosity. And those Spanish classes she used to talk about, she finally signed up for them. She enrolled. She paid for them. It felt like the beginning of something new, something exciting. But Anita Cobby would never get to attend those Spanish classes. About 6 weeks into their separation, Anita and John met up again. They weren't divorced, not even officially separated. They were just taking time. And now, they were ready to talk about where this was all going. They ended up booking a romantic weekend getaway on the coast, a chance to reconnect, to just be with each other without distractions. And according to John, it worked beautifully. He said it felt like their honeymoon all over again. They laughed, they talked, they said, "I love you," more times than he could count. It was warm, real, healing. They even made plans real, solid plans to buy a house together once they got back home, to start again, to finally begin the little family they talked about so many times before. On Saturday, the 1st of February, 1986, Anita and John went to his parents' house for dinner. His sister was there too. And in the middle of that dinner, smiling and full of hope, they told the family they were going to start house hunting on Monday, just 2 days away. They were beaming. You could see it. They were excited. They were in love. And it felt like they were finally on the same page. But Anita would never get the chance to go house hunting. The very next day, Sunday, the 2nd of February, was just a normal day. At least, it started that way. Anita got up early for her hospital shift, like she always did. It was a long commute, about an hour-long train ride from Blacktown to Sydney, but she didn't mind. She worked her full shift, and afterward, she had plans with a couple of her co-workers to grab dinner in a nearby city called Redfern. The three of them had a lovely evening, shared some wine, good food, and good conversation. It was just a chilled night out after a day at work. Around 8 o'clock or 8:30 p.m., they all started heading home. One of Anita's friends dropped her off at Central Railway Station so she could catch her train back to Blacktown. She made it onto her train just fine. She got back to Blacktown Station without issue. But it was right there at Blacktown Station that things started to unravel. Usually, when Anita arrived at Blacktown Station after work, she'd head straight to one of the payphones and call her dad to come pick her up. It was a simple routine. He'd meet her at the station and they'd drive the short distance home together. But this night was different. When Anita walked over to the payphones, she found they were completely out of order. All of them. The entire bank of phones had been vandalized and wasn't working. And this was the 1980s. Mobile phones weren't really a thing yet. At least not for everyday people. Those payphones were her only way of contacting her dad. She tried to find a taxi next. She walked over to the local taxi rank, but it was empty. No cars, no drivers, nothing. It was about 10 p.m. now. It was dark. It wasn't safe. But the walk home was just under 2 miles, and Anita, trying to stay practical, figured she'd be okay. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't far. So she set off on foot. The next morning, Anita's parents woke up and immediately realized something was wrong. Anita had never come home. Her dad checked the phone. No missed calls. Nothing to say she'd made it to the station. But they didn't panic, not yet. They knew she'd gone out with some coworkers in Sydney. They figured maybe she'd had a couple drinks and decided to stay the night at a friend's place. She had her work clothes, so that made sense. It wasn't completely out of character, so they went about their morning not too worried. I mean, Anita was 26 years old, a grown woman. She didn't have to call every time she changed plans. She had her own life. But then, the phone rang. It was one of Anita's coworkers, one of the friends she'd been out with the night before, calling to ask if Anita was okay, where she was, if she'd made it home safely. And that's when the realization hit them. Both sides of the call thought Anita was with the other. Her parents assumed she stayed in Sydney. Her friends assumed she'd gotten home to Blacktown. But in truth, no one had seen her since the train station. That's when the panic set in. Anita's father didn't wait a second. He went straight to the police station and reported her missing. Meanwhile, Grace and Anita's mom stayed home and started calling everyone. Every single friend, every coworker, anyone who might have seen her. But no one had. No one had heard from her. No one had gotten a message or a phone call. Of course, one of the people Grace called was John, Anita's husband. He was still living in Sydney, working his usual shifts. When he picked up and heard what was happening, he was immediately concerned. He said he hadn't seen Anita, hadn't heard from her. She hadn't come to his house. Without hesitation, John got on a train and made the hour-long trip to Blacktown to be with Anita's family. But even though John Cobby rushed to be with Anita's family that day, things weren't exactly smooth between him and her parents, especially with her dad, Gary. Their relationship had been a little strained. It's not that they hated him, but they weren't exactly his biggest fans either. At this point, Anita and John had reconciled. They'd just come back from that romantic trip to the coast, made plans to move in together and start over. Things were genuinely looking hopeful again. But there was still some history there. Old arguments, lingering tension, and John could feel it the moment he stepped into the house. That heaviness, that awkwardness. He later said it felt like he wasn't really welcome, like maybe they didn't want him there. And to be honest, it wasn't just quiet tension either. That very day, the same day Anita was reported missing, John and Anita's father got into it. They snapped at each other. It was messy, emotional, and raw. John would ask things like, "Did you call this person? Have you spoken to that friend?" And Gary, already overwhelmed, would fire back, "Of course I have. She's my daughter." They were both scared, both exhausted, and both desperate to find Anita. But instead of being able to support each other, their panic just turned into frustration. And I think sometimes grief does that. It turns fear into blame, worry into conflict, especially when you're both trying to do the right thing but feel like it's not enough. So, in the end, John decided it was best to leave, not because he didn't care, but because staying was only making things worse. He didn't want to cause more stress. He didn't want to push Gary or Grace any further. So, quietly, he got back on the train and returned to Sydney. While Anita's parents were doing everything they could in Blacktown, calling hospitals, checking with neighbors, contacting anyone who might have seen her, John and her coworkers were doing the same in Sydney. Friends, nurses, former classmates, everyone was reaching out, searching, hoping, but nothing. No phone call, no sightings, not even a hint of where she might have gone. By now, it was the second day since Anita had disappeared, and still not a single trace. Then, around 9:30 in the morning, police received a call from a local farmer. This farmer had gone out that morning, just like he did every day, to check on his cows. But as he walked across his property, he noticed something odd. All of the cows were huddled together in one corner of the field. It wasn't impossible behavior, but it definitely wasn't normal. Still, he brushed it off. Maybe they were just curious about something. He went off to check on another part of the farm, maybe some fences, maybe another group of animals. But when he came back, the cows were still there, all gathered around the exact same spot. At that point, he figured something must have been lying in the grass, maybe a dead animal, maybe a dog or a fox that wandered too close. So he got on his quad bike and drove over to investigate. But as he pulled closer, he realized this wasn't an animal. There was something lying motionless on the ground. A shape, a body. It was the naked body of a woman lying face down in the dirt, surrounded by cows. And the farmer said that the moment he saw her, he just knew. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had been horrific. Her body told a story he wished he didn't have to see. It wasn't just death, it was torture. The farmer immediately called the police, and officers arrived quickly at the scene. The woman's body was carefully recovered and taken in for an autopsy. And because Anita had only been reported missing the day before, and she was the only woman reported missing in the area, police already had a strong feeling about who this might be. They didn't wait for the formal paperwork. They just knew. To confirm it, they called Anita's family in. The idea was to show them some of the jewelry that had been recovered from the scene, small personal items that might help them identify her without having to see her body. Among the pieces was a ring. It was delicate but very unique, two bands that crossed over each other like a twisted knot. It looked like a wedding ring. And when John Cobby saw it, his heart dropped. He knew that ring. That was Anita's. Even during their separation, she'd never stopped wearing it. Through all 6 weeks they were apart, she'd kept it on like a quiet reminder that the love hadn't gone anywhere. Even in death, she was still wearing it. But then her sister, Catherine, looked at the ring and said something that threw them all off. She said, "That can't be Anita's. Look at it, it's dirty. It's all rusty." Anita never let her jewelry look like that. And that's when one of the detectives gently stepped in and said, "That's not rust. It's dried blood." That moment hit the family like a wall. It wasn't just confirmation that Anita was gone. It was the first chilling clue that whatever had happened to her hadn't been peaceful. There had been pain. There had been violence. The ring was proof. So while the police were almost certain that the body belonged to Anita Cobby, and the jewelry essentially confirmed it, they still needed formal identification. And that meant asking someone from her family to see her to make it official. The first person police asked to formally identify the body was, of course, John Cobby, Anita's husband. But John, he just couldn't do it. He didn't know what had happened to her yet, not in full detail. But something inside him already knew it hadn't been peaceful. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her like that. Seeing the woman he loved, his wife, lifeless, brutalized, it would have broken him completely. So he declined. At that point, Anita's parents stepped forward, Grace and Gary, her mom and dad. They said, "If John can't do it, then we will." But the detectives stepped in almost immediately. They looked at Grace, Anita's mother, and told her gently, but firmly, "We're not going to let you do this. We can't let a mother see her daughter like this. It's not something you'll ever be able to forget." So that left only one person, Gary, Anita's father. He walked into that room alone. No one with him. No one to hold his hand or steady his knees. Just him and the silence. He said that even before the sheet was pulled back, even just seeing the table, he felt sick. There was something about the stillness in that room, the weight of it, that told him everything he needed to know. And then the sheet was pulled back, and there she was, his daughter, Anita, lifeless, lying cold and pale on a still table in front of him. And in that moment, Gary Lynch collapsed to the ground. It was immediately clear, just from looking at her body, that Anita Cobby had suffered immensely in her final moments. She had been brutally, savagely tortured. Both of her eyes were swollen and blackened, two large bruises that made it look like she'd taken repeated blows to the face. Her nose was broken. Both of her cheekbones were shattered. Her entire body from shoulders to arms, legs to chest was covered in scrapes and abrasions, and the injuries weren't random. It was clear that certain parts of her body had been deliberately targeted, especially her breasts, which had multiple marks and cuts that suggested focused, intentional harm. There were also small lacerations all over her skin, not stab wounds, but shallow slash marks, as if someone had cut her just for the purpose of hurting her. Her hands, wrists, and arms were covered in defensive wounds. One of her fingers had been cut completely down the middle. Several were fractured signs that she had tried desperately to fight back. On her other hand, 3 of her fingers were almost entirely severed. Investigators believed she may have tried to grab a knife or maybe push it away from her throat, and in doing so, she nearly lost her fingers. One of her ears had been completely severed, another injury that served no purpose other than cruelty. And I think that's one of the hardest things to accept, the sheer level of unnecessary violence. It wasn't just about killing her, it was about making her suffer. Anita had been violently sexually assaulted, repeatedly. Some reports even mentioned that there was mutilation to her genitals. Her body had been desecrated in ways that were almost too horrific to imagine, and all of this while she was still alive. The autopsy revealed that her final cause of death was a massive slash to the side of her neck. Her throat had been cut so deeply, she was nearly decapitated, and as if that wasn't already unbearable enough, the coroner noted that parasites had already begun feeding on her open wounds. It hadn't even been 48 hours. People who saw Anita's body, the farmer who found her, the officers on the scene, the coroners, the pathologists, they all said the same thing. Her eyes were still open. And in those eyes, there was a look that no one could forget. Even in death, the fear hadn't left her. There was terror frozen in her expression. A kind of agony that clung to her face, haunting, heartbreaking. Gary Lynch, Anita's father, took one look at her lying on that table and said something that would stay with people forever. I wish I could say that's not my daughter, but then it would be somebody else's daughter. And they'd be going through what I'm going through now. And that moment right there was when everything became official. The body had been formally identified as that of 26-year-old Anita Cobby. And with that confirmation, police knew they were racing against the clock. This wasn't just about bringing justice to one family. This wasn't just about solving a case. Whoever had done this, whoever was capable of this level of violence and cruelty was still out there, still walking the streets of Blacktown, still a threat. And they knew they had to find them, fast. One of the very first things police did was go back to the farmer who had discovered Anita's body. They asked him everything, what he saw, what he heard, anything at all that might have stood out that night. He told them he hadn't seen anything unusual, but when he thought back to that Sunday evening, the night Anita went missing, something did come to mind. He remembered hearing screams, a woman's screams. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. That field, unfortunately, was often used by teenagers as a hangout spot. It wasn't uncommon for him to hear shouting or laughing or people just messing around in the distance. So when he heard those screams that night, he figured it was just more of the same. Kids being rowdy. He never imagined, not even for a second, that someone might have been dying out there in the dark. But now, looking back, he knew exactly what he'd heard. Police then canvassed the area, asking the handful of people who lived near the field if they'd heard anything strange that night. A few did. They too recalled hearing a scream on that Sunday evening. And with that, investigators were able to confirm something chilling. Anita Cobby had still been alive when she was brought to that field. Up until then, they weren't sure, maybe she'd been killed elsewhere and her body dumped there later, but now it was clear. Much of her ordeal had happened right there in that open, quiet farmland. So the next question was she kidnapped? Police combed the field for evidence, anything that could help them piece this together. But there was nothing. No weapon, no clothes, no tire tracks, no identifying marks. The scene had been stripped clean. They were left with a body and silence. With the physical trail running cold, police turned to the people who knew Anita best. They started with her inner circle, her friends, her co-workers, her husband, and of course, her parents. The first formal interview was with Gary and Grace Lynch. Police asked them if Anita had any enemies, anyone who might want to hurt her. Was there a reason she might have been targeted specifically? And that's when they learned something the police hadn't known. Anita had recently separated from her husband, and in the eyes of the investigators, that was a very big red flag. In most murder investigations, the first person police look at is the partner, the husband, the wife, the boyfriend, the girlfriend. And especially in cases where there's been a recent separation, that suspicion only grows stronger. Could John Cobby have killed Anita out of jealousy, out of anger? That's the question that started creeping into the back of investigators' minds. In his first interview with police, John appeared absolutely shattered. He was visibly distressed as he identified Anita's wedding ring. He broke down in front of them. He told officers that he blamed himself for what had happened. He said that if he had just been with her that night, if they hadn't been apart, then maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe he could have protected her. He seemed completely and utterly broken by the loss of his wife. Still, detectives had a job to do. So they began digging, asking about the dynamics of their relationship, what had gone wrong, why they had separated, and eventually they asked the question that mattered most. Where were you on Sunday night? That was the night Anita disappeared, and most likely, the night she was murdered. John told them he had just gone home after work in Sydney. Said he stayed in that evening, didn't go anywhere, didn't see anyone, just stayed in. Then the next morning, he went back to work at the hospital. Later that evening, he said, he went out with his father and his brother, and for detectives, that wasn't good enough. Staying home alone, no witnesses, no phone calls to confirm it, that wasn't a solid alibi, it was barely an alibi at all. Their suspicion grew, so they kept asking questions. They spoke to people who knew Anita, her co-workers, her friends, and what they found was interesting. John had always been a little intense when it came to Anita. Some described it as an obsession. At first, it had been sweet, romantic even. He adored her. But toward the end of the marriage, especially during their separation, that adoration turned clingy, controlling. He'd call her constantly, text her while she is out with friends. He begged her to take him back over and over again, every single day. But Anita, she wasn't ready. She needed space, and she was finally beginning to enjoy her freedom again. To police, that painted a possible motive. If she didn't want to come back to him, maybe, just maybe, he thought, if I can't have you, no one can. The investigation pressed on, and eventually, one of the detectives just said it outright. Did you kill Anita? John Cobby immediately denied it. But he said that from the moment those words were spoken, that direct accusation, everything in his mind just blurred. He described it like a fog had dropped over his thoughts. His head started spinning. His vision felt fuzzy. He was overwhelmed, not just emotionally, but physically, like his brain couldn't keep up with what was happening. Police, meanwhile, were growing increasingly frustrated. They kept repeating it. You did it. You did it. Just say you did it. And this line of questioning began to escalate until it crossed over into what's known as enhanced interrogation. If you've never heard of that term before, it's a tactic where police use physical pressure to break down a suspect mentally and emotionally. According to John, this is exactly what happened. He says detectives began shoving him, pushing him backward, getting in his face. They started yelling, demanding answers. Just admit it. You killed Anita. You killed your wife. And he says they didn't stop there. At some point, they slammed him against the wall, pushed him to the ground, threw him back again. The back of his head hit the concrete wall. Again and again they said, you did it. You did it. John's mental state was already fragile. He was exhausted, grieving, confused. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't process what was happening. And eventually, something inside him just broke. He looked up at the officers, dazed, and said, yeah, I did it. I must have done it. Police had a confession from John Cobby that he had killed his wife. But here's the strange part. Even though John had just confessed, even though it was the exact outcome the detectives had been pushing for, demanding for, they didn't seem satisfied. They had spent hours trying to pull this confession out of him, pressuring him, cornering him, and yet once he said, "I did it," something about it didn't sit right. It was almost like they knew they had forced him into it, that it hadn't come naturally, that it wasn't the truth, so they went back. They returned to the autopsy report, trying to reanalyze everything, looking for something to confirm that it really was John, that he could have done all of this. But as they reviewed the report, something started to jump out. The injuries on Anita's body, they weren't all the same. They looked like they'd been inflicted by different people, using different methods. Some were from blunt force, some from sharp objects, some deep, others shallow, some were frenzied, some precise. And that's when they started to say it out loud. This can't be the work of just one person. There were too many layers to what had happened, too many methods, too much variety in the violence. If you look closely, it didn't feel like a single attacker. It felt like a group, multiple killers, multiple attackers. So even though John Cobby still seemed suspicious, in some ways no solid alibi, intense attachment to Anita, the detective started to feel it deep down. He didn't do this. He couldn't have done all of this. They changed their minds. They decided that John's confession wasn't real, that it had been pulled from him under pressure, not freely given, not truthful. And just like that, John Cobby was ruled out as a suspect. Even though police had pushed him to the edge and worn him down to the point of a false confession, after everything, the interrogation, the false confession, and being ruled out as a suspect, John Cobby completely broke down. Mentally, emotionally, he was wrecked. And honestly, who wouldn't be? His wife had been brutally murdered. The woman he loved more than anything, the one he had just started rebuilding a future with, was gone. Taken in the most violent, horrifying way imaginable. His whole world collapsed. To cope with the loss, John turned to alcohol and then to something even darker. 3 days after Anita's body was found, John injected heroin for the first time in his life. And it didn't stop there. He spiraled. Hard. He began drinking heavily, taking heroin regularly. Before long, it wasn't just coping, it was dependency. Full-blown addiction. And it changed him. Not just emotionally, but physically, mentally, spiritually. He wasn't the same man anymore. His family, his friends, even Anita's family, they all said they barely recognized him. At Anita's funeral, the pain and the drugs were too much. He was so intoxicated that he couldn't even stand. He stumbled through the service, visibly out of control. And when it came time for the coffin to be carried out of the room, John lost it. He started screaming, "No. Don't take her away from me. Don't take her away from me." He was sobbing, yelling, completely inconsolable. 2 grown men, his father and another relative, had to physically drag him out of the funeral hall. He was loud, disruptive, heartbroken, and utterly lost. Later on, John would look back at that moment with deep regret. He hated how he acted, but at the same time, everyone understood. Everyone saw the pain he was drowning in. He wasn't just mourning the loss of a wife. He was mourning the loss of a whole future. John later admitted that all the heroin, all the alcohol, it wasn't just about escape. It was about dying. In his words, he said he was trying to kill himself. Not directly, not intentionally, but slowly, quietly. He hoped that one day he'd just take too much and not wake up. He said he didn't have the guts to end it outright. So he was hoping the drugs would do it for him. While all of this was happening, while John was spiraling and grieving, police were still pressing forward with the investigation. By now, John Cobby had been completely cleared as a suspect. He was no longer under suspicion. But that left detectives right back where they started with no leads, no suspects, just a brutal crime and a growing sense of pressure. So they shifted their focus. They began looking into people who might have had the opportunity or the motive to harm Anita that night. They reviewed lists of known sex offenders in the area, especially those living near Blacktown Station or along the route Anita would have walked home. They focused on anyone with a history of violence toward women, or any prior sexual assault convictions. A few people caught their attention. They brought them in, questioned them, but one by one, they were ruled out. Police even interviewed nearly every taxi driver in the area, especially those who worked at the taxi rank near the station that Anita had tried to use that night. Dozens were brought in, each one questioned. None of them seemed suspicious. None of them were involved. Then, a memory resurfaced. One of the officers remembered a phone call they'd received on the night Anita disappeared. At the time, it hadn't seemed like much. Anita hadn't even been reported missing yet. There was no reason to connect the call to anything serious. But now, looking back, everything clicked. That phone call had come from just 2 streets away from Blacktown train station. And in that moment, the officer realized these might be connected. The call had come from a teenage boy and his mother. That night, they were sitting together in their living room, just watching television like any other night, when they suddenly heard a scream, a woman's scream. And not just a quick, startled shout, this was a long, drawn-out, agonizing scream. The boy said it lasted at least 30 seconds, long enough to know this wasn't playful. This wasn't kids messing around on the street. This was terror. A woman in absolute fear for her life. It was around 9:45 p.m. The boy turned to his mother, wide-eyed, and said, "What the hell was that?" The scream was still going, still cutting through the night. His instinct kicked in. He ran out the front door and down to the end of his garden, and that's when he saw it. A car. The car the boy saw was parked strangely, its headlights off, just sitting silently on the side of the street. And as soon as he reached the edge of his garden, it suddenly pulled a sharp U-turn and began driving down the street, straight toward him. And even as it moved, the headlights stayed off. That instantly set off alarm bells in the boy's mind. It was nearly 10 p.m., completely dark. No normal driver would be cruising around with their lights off, not unless they were trying to hide. As the car passed him, the boy noticed several people inside a group of boys. Teenagers, maybe young men. But there was one in particular in the back seat who locked eyes with him and didn't look away. The whole time the car passed, this one guy just stared at him. Cold, intense. Even when the car moved past, this same guy turned his head to keep looking back at the boy, tracking him, watching him, and then the boy noticed something odd. This guy in the back, he looked like he was ducking. His head was awkwardly low, like it was pressed up near the ceiling of the car. And it wasn't because he was tall, it looked like he was sitting on something. Something that made him sit higher than he should have. And when the boy put all of that together, the scream, the lights off car, the weird behavior, and now someone possibly sitting on something or someone had hit him, he might have just witnessed a kidnapping. Right then, like fate stepping in, his neighbor pulled into their driveway. The boy didn't hesitate. He ran straight up to the car, jumped in, and said, "I know you just got home, but we need to follow that car. Now." The neighbor didn't ask questions. He just drove. They got to the end of the road, trying to spot the vehicle, but it had already vanished. Still, they didn't give up. They kept driving. 10 minutes, 15, maybe 20. Just looping around the area, hoping to get lucky. And then, somewhere along a quiet, winding farm lane, the boy saw it. The car. The same car he'd seen moments earlier. The same car where he'd heard the scream. The same car where that man had been sitting too high in the back seat. The 2 men, the teenage boy and his neighbor, pulled over and got out of their car. They grabbed a flashlight, walked toward the parked vehicle, and shone the beam inside. But there was nothing. The car was empty. No one inside. Nothing visibly out of place. And for a second, they wondered if maybe they'd made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't the same car after all. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Still, just to be sure, they swept their flashlights over the surrounding fields, just in case. Maybe someone had run out there. Maybe someone was hiding. But the night was still silent. Nothing. So they got back in their car and drove home. Later, the teenage boy called the police and told them everything he'd seen. The scream, the men in the car, the U-turn, the guy in the back staring him down. But at that point, Anita Cobby hadn't even been reported missing yet, so his call didn't set off any alarms. It wasn't until 3, 4, maybe 5 days into the investigation that police circled back. Now that they knew what had happened to Anita, that old call from a nearby street suddenly seemed very important. They brought the boy in for questioning. He told them everything again. He explained that he hadn't gotten a good look at the men in the car, it had been dark, and they never stopped. The only reason he noticed the guy in the back staring at him was because, for a second, the car passed under a street light. That flash of light was enough to catch the man's eyes cold, locked in on him, but not enough to remember his face. Still, he did remember the car, and he described it in detail. Now the police had something, a starting point, a lead. So they began going door to door along that street, interviewing neighbors, asking if anyone else had seen or heard anything that night. And it turned out someone had 2 more people, teenagers, again, siblings came forward, and their story changed everything. They had witnessed the same car, but unlike the first boy, they had caught the actual kidnapping in progress. They said they saw a group of men physically dragging a dark-haired woman, screaming and struggling and forcing her into the back of that car. They didn't know it at the time, but they had watched Anita Cobby's abduction unfold right in front of them. This was a breakthrough. Now, the police had witnesses, a location, a time frame, a description of the car, and the confirmation they needed that Anita had been taken alive right there on that street in Blacktown. Private as possible. They don't tell the press everything. They don't release full autopsy details. They don't say exactly what they're looking for or who they suspect. It's all carefully controlled to protect the integrity of the investigation. So you can imagine the police's shock when they found out that Anita Cobby's autopsy report had been leaked. Not just leaked, but read aloud. Live. On morning radio. The man who did it, one of the biggest radio personalities in all of Australia at the time, John Laws. It was a regular weekday morning, Thursday, and people were just going about their day, making breakfast, driving to work, taking kids to school. And then, in the middle of this routine, this man started reading Anita Cobby's entire autopsy live on air. Every gruesome detail. And I think it's hard to overstate how shocking that moment was. First of all, this was morning radio. That's the time when most families are tuned in. When parents have the radio on in the background while packing lunches. When kids are brushing their teeth or putting on their uniforms, that's when this was broadcast. Second, no one in Anita's family had been warned. Her parents, Grace and Gary, were listening live when they heard it. They didn't know this was going to happen. No warning. No chance to prepare, no choice. And then there was the deeper problem, the fact that this kind of public broadcast could seriously damage the police investigation. If the wrong people heard it, or if too much was exposed too soon, it could affect witness testimonies, tamper with evidence, even give the killers information about what the police did or didn't know. People were outraged, because not only was it horrifying and disrespectful, it was dangerous. After John Laws read Anita Cobby's autopsy live on the radio, the public reaction was immediate and intense. People already knew Anita had been kidnapped and murdered. That alone was terrifying. But now, they knew how it happened, the details, the horror, and it changed everything. The whole country went into panic. People were afraid to leave their homes after dark. Women were scared to walk alone. Parents held their children tighter. Because now it wasn't just a tragic headline, it was real. They knew exactly what had been done to her. And they knew that whoever had done it was still out there, still walking free. John Laws, the radio host who leaked it all, defended himself. He said he felt the public had a right to know that people needed to be aware of the kind of monsters who could do something like this, that it was his duty to inform them. But for Anita's family, it was devastating. They didn't know. They hadn't been told. Police had intentionally withheld the full autopsy from them, not to hide the truth, but to protect them, to spare them the unimaginable images of what Anita had endured. They hadn't even let her mother see the body, remember? And now, They were learning the worst details of their daughter's murder at the exact same moment as everyone else, just sitting there in their kitchen listening to the morning news. It was cruel, unintentional, maybe, but still cruel. And yet, if there was any sliver of light to come from this awful breach, it was that the country came together. The whole of Australia now felt this case, not just read about it, not just pitied it. They were angry, they were grieving, and they wanted justice. People came together, private donors, companies, everyday citizens, and raised $50,000 as a reward for any information, for any lead, just something to help catch whoever had done this. There were marches, campaigns, protesters holding signs, people calling into police stations, reporters trying to dig up connections. Strangers who had never even met Anita were desperate to help. And then, about a week into the investigation, the breakthrough came. It started with a tip. A police informant, someone they had worked with before, came forward and told detectives about a group of men who had stolen a car on the very same night Anita disappeared. And the description of that stolen car? It was a perfect match for the vehicle seen by the teenage boy and the two siblings the night of Anita's abduction. Could this be the car? Could this lead them straight to Anita Cobby's killers? The police informant originally gave detectives 3 names connected to the stolen car names that would soon become central to the entire case: John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and Leslie Murphy. A few days later, the informant came back with 2 more names: the Murphy brothers, Gary and Mick. That made 5 men in total, a group, a gang, 3 of whom were literally brothers. Now, police were focusing in on this group of 5, and it wasn't like these were strangers to law enforcement. Each and every one of them had some kind of criminal history or at least prior contact with police. And here's the twist. John Travers had actually come up before. Way back, right at the start of the investigation, maybe even before Anita's body was found, police had received an anonymous tip. Someone had called in and simply said, "Look into John Travers." No context, no evidence, just a strong warning. The caller didn't have anything directly linking him to Anita's murder, but they believed he was more than capable of doing something like that. And as police would soon learn, they weren't wrong. Now, back to the tip about the stolen car. The informant had actually seen Travers, Murphy, and Murdoch riding around in it. That was enough to bring them in. So police tracked the 3 men down, arrested them, and brought them to the station officially for car theft. And here's where the detectives got clever. They didn't want to scare these guys off. They didn't want them to know they were actually suspects in the Anita Cobby case. That would have made them defensive or worse, sent them running. So officially, the charges were just about the car. But during the interrogations, detectives started to gently probe, subtle questions, little mentions of Anita, her name, her case. Nothing too direct, just enough to watch their reactions. If one of them flinched, looked away, got nervous, that would be the opening police needed, just enough to go deeper, to shift the conversation, to start asking real questions about what happened to Anita Cobby. When police casually brought up Anita's case during questioning, Michael Murdoch and Leslie Murphy gave absolutely nothing away. Not a word, not even a flicker. They didn't react to the name. They didn't flinch, just blank, unreadable faces. If they were hiding something, they were doing a good job. So the police were left with nothing to go on, no leverage, no cracks in the wall. But then came John Travers. Unlike the others, he wasn't arrested at home. Police found him in his car. And during the arrest, they searched the vehicle standard procedure, and inside, they found something alarming. A knife. And this wasn't just any knife. There were bloodstains on it. It instantly became the focal point of his interview. And it was through this knife that police decided to subtly ease in a mention of Anita's case. They didn't go in hard, they didn't accuse him. They just used the knife as a bridge, a way to test his reaction. And that reaction was immediate. As soon as it came up, John Travers snapped. He said, "I didn't slit that throat." And here's the thing. No one had said anything about a throat. No one had said anything about Anita. No one had even mentioned her name yet. That sentence came from him. And in that moment, the room changed. Because this wasn't a man being accused. This was a man exposing himself with a guilty conscience. His own mind betrayed him before the officers even got there. It was clear to police that John Travers knew exactly what had happened to Anita because he had been there. So, while Murdoch and Murphy were released, Travers was kept in custody. Now, the stolen car didn't matter so much anymore. This was about Anita Cobby, and the police were just getting started. Before we go deeper into the rest of this case, I think it's important to understand who these men were, what kind of people they were, what kind of lives they came from. Because while it doesn't excuse anything not even close, it does give us insight into how someone could become capable of something so unthinkable. Let's start with John Travers. He was just 20 years old at the time, one of the youngest in the group, if not the youngest, but police believed he was the ringleader, the one the others followed, the one who set the tone. And from the beginning, John's life was nothing short of tragic. He grew up in deep poverty. His father was abusive, physically abusive, and according to some, even sexually abusive. That part was never officially confirmed, but what was confirmed is that his home life was traumatic, chaotic, damaging. John struggled mentally from a very young age. And like so many kids who grow up in unstable homes, he turned to anything that could numb the pain. For him, it started with alcohol and drugs. He was just 12 or 13 when he started using. By 14, he was already dependent. He was an alcoholic, addicted to drugs, and eventually he got kicked out of school because of it. That left him with nothing, no structure, no guidance, no future to work toward. So he spent his days drifting. He'd hang around the streets, drink, get high, and when he needed money, he'd rob people, steal from shops, do whatever it took to feed the addictions that had already swallowed him whole. At a certain point, John Travers became too much for his mother to handle. He was constantly in trouble literally every day, something new. Whether it was stealing, drinking, fighting, she just couldn't cope anymore. So eventually, she made the heartbreaking decision to send him away. It wasn't exactly a juvenile detention center, more like a facility for troubled teens. Somewhere she hoped he might finally get some help. Some structure, a reset, but nothing changed. When he came back, it was as if he'd never left. He went straight back to drugs, straight back to alcohol, straight back to crime. And then things got even worse. Around this time, his mother fell seriously ill. She was hospitalized, unable to care for any of her children. John had siblings, several of them, and with no one left to look after them, the kids were split up and sent into foster care. That's where everything shifted. Where John Travers' life went from bad to monstrous. He wasn't just robbing people anymore. He wasn't just loitering, drinking, or breaking into shops. He started becoming sexually violent. And then, something that's almost impossible to say out loud. John Travers began committing acts of bestiality. He once bragged about stealing a sheep from a nearby field, claiming his original plan was just to kill it, cook it, and eat it. But before he did that, he sodomized it, slit its throat. And according to some reports, he ejaculated into the wound. It's one of the most depraved and disturbing things I've ever heard in any true crime case. At the time police were looking into John Travers for Anita's murder, he was actually already a suspect in another case, a rape that had occurred not far from where Anita was taken. And in that case, it had chilling similarities. In that incident, the victim, a man, had been forced into the back of a car and raped at knife point, just like Anita. She was also taken in the back of a car. She was threatened and eventually attacked with a knife. It was all far too similar to be a coincidence. And when police connected that detail to the way John Travers had reacted during his own questioning, the way he snapped when they brought up a knife, not even mentioning Anita, the suspicion only grew stronger. There was also something else that disturbed investigators. During his interview, Travers referred to Anita as a slut. And that word, that choice of language, told them everything. Because why would someone who supposedly didn't know Anita speak about her like that? If he had no connection to her, if she was just a name he'd heard on the news, why such venom? Why such aggression? It was personal. It sounded personal. It revealed how he saw her and likely how he justified what he'd done. Now, on to the rest of the group. The next name police had was 18-year-old Michael Murdoch. Turns out he was actually the youngest, not Travers. Michael was John's childhood best friend, his sidekick, his shadow. And his life was almost a mirror image of Travers's minus the abuse. Once they met as teens, they were inseparable. They did everything together: drugs, drinking, crime. When Travers got kicked out of school, Murdoch did too. When Travers started robbing stores, Murdoch was right there. If one went to juvenile detention, so did the other. It was like Murdoch was just following the blueprint of Travers's life. The third man named early on was Leslie Murphy, 22 years old, the youngest of the Murphy brothers, but the oldest of the initial three suspects. He had a criminal history like the others, mostly petty stuff, robberies, thefts, nothing violent on paper. But Leslie was known for his temper. People described him as angry, explosive, someone you didn't want to push too far. Though, as far as police could tell, he wasn't known for hurting past partners or anything like that. Then there were the two other Murphy brothers. Mick Murphy, the eldest, was 32 at the time of Anita's murder. There wasn't much written about him. No major red flags. He had the occasional charge thefts, minor robberies, but nothing frequent or particularly violent. He seemed to stay out of trouble more than the others. And finally, Gary Murphy, 28, the middle brother. Gary had a lifelong hearing impairment which had a major impact on his development. It affected his schooling, he dropped out early, and he never really caught up. He didn't get much education, and according to reports, he just kind of followed his brothers around, got dragged into whatever they were doing. And like Travers, Gary also ended up in a cycle of crime. He was known for stealing cars, breaking into them, selling them, but again, no history of violent offenses that stood out. So that's the group, 5 men. None of them work. None of them have real goals or plans. All of them petty criminals, couch surfers. Most didn't even have homes. They just drifted, taking drugs, drinking, robbing where they could, and living day to day with no structure, no accountability, and no conscience. When you looked at this group of 5 men, there was one name that stood out more than the rest: John Travers. At just 20 years old, he already had the darkest history, violent offenses, acts of bestiality, suspected rape, and a deeply disturbing pattern of sexual aggression. He wasn't just another petty criminal, he was something else, something worse. Police were monitoring all 5 men, but Travers quickly became their main focus, especially after the way he reacted at the police station, snapping at officers, blurting out, "I didn't slit that throat," before anyone even said the word Anita. So they kept him in custody. While he was there, John asked the police for a favor. He wanted cigarettes. He said he didn't have any and couldn't get them himself, so he asked if he could call a friend to bring some to the station. Since he couldn't make the call himself, he gave them a number and asked them to call for him. Police called the number. A woman answered. It turned out she was his aunt. She agreed to bring the cigarettes, and when she arrived at the station, police took her aside for a quiet conversation. They didn't let her see John right away. They wanted to ask her a few things about him, about their relationship, about anything she might know. And that's when she said something that shocked them. She told the officers, "Honestly, I'm glad you've got him in there, because I was just about to call you and give his name myself." She explained that she'd had this horrible gut feeling for the past 2 weeks. She couldn't sleep. Something inside her just knew that her nephew had been involved in Anita's murder. She had no proof, no solid evidence, just a deep, unshakable instinct. Because she knew what John was capable of, that's when police asked her a big question. Would she be willing to help them? Would she go into that room now, while he was still there wearing a hidden microphone, and try to get him to talk? She agreed. Police wired her up, and she walked into the room where John was waiting, cigarettes in hand, acting casual, like nothing was out of the ordinary. She didn't want to make him suspicious, so she played it calmly. Friendly. She asked if he knew Anita. He said yes. She asked if he'd had sex with her. Again, he said yes. She kept digging slowly, carefully, and eventually it came out. It wasn't consensual. It wasn't sex. It was rape. John Travers told his aunt that all 5 of the men were drunk that night. They all raped Anita, every single one of them. And then, he said, as the alcohol started to wear off, as the haze began to clear, he realized how bad it was, how serious, how much trouble they were in if Anita survived and went to the police. That's when he knew they couldn't let her live. And right there, during that conversation on tape, John Travers confessed. He told his aunt that he was the one who slit Anita Cobby's throat. Then, disturbingly, he asked her for another favor. He wanted her to go to his house, find the knife he used, because it was his favorite knife and he wanted to keep it. He also asked her to find the clothes he wore the night of the murder. He hadn't washed them. They still had blood on them. During that same wiretap conversation, John Travers started laying out an escape plan, right there in the police station. He told his aunt that he wanted to break out of the holding cell and he wanted her help to do it. She was going to play a major role in this wild, last-minute scheme. So here was the plan. Next to the police station was a train station, and behind that, a bridge. Travers told his aunt, "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go up to the train station and you're going to derail one of the trains." He said the train would then fly off the tracks, crash into the back of the police station, blow a hole through the wall, and in all the chaos, he'd escape. Just like that. Out the wall. On the run. But as he was explaining it, even he seemed to realize how insane it sounded, how impossible it was. So, he switched to plan B. This time, he told his aunt to go and speak to Michael Murdoch and Leslie Murphy. He wanted her to help organize a new plan, one that involved them coming to the police station between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m., when staffing would be at its lowest. He said they needed to show up with guns drawn, barge into the station, demand that Travers be released, and then the 3 of them would flee together into the night. His aunt nodded along, pretended to agree, played the part. But of course she didn't go to his house, she didn't call his friends, she didn't move a muscle for him because by then, she was working with police. And when she walked out of that room, back to the officers, she collapsed. She just broke down, burst into tears, completely shaken by everything she had just heard. Because deep down, she had suspected he was involved. But hearing it out loud, hearing it from his mouth, was something else entirely. It hit her hard. It broke her. And police now had his confession on tape. They sat down and listened to every second of that recording, and what they heard made their skin crawl. Because even as John Travers described what they had done to Anita Cobby, he was laughing. And at one point, his aunt even told him, "Don't laugh. This isn't funny." She pleaded with him. "This isn't you. These things you're saying, they don't sound like you. Have you ever done anything like this before?" And John, he just laughed. Just a side note, when he asked her to go to his house to get the knife and the jeans he wore that night, the one still stained with blood, of course she didn't go. She didn't destroy evidence. She didn't hide anything. Instead, she told the police and they went to the house themselves and seized everything. Now that police had John Travers' confession, they knew, or at least believed, that all 5 men had been involved in Anita Cobby's abduction and murder. But there was a problem. As powerful as Travers' statement was, it was still just his words. And maybe, just maybe, he was trying to shift some of the blame. Maybe he was trying to drag others down with him to make himself look less guilty. So police couldn't take his confession at face value. Not yet. What they needed was corroboration, a second confession. Preferably from someone else in the group, someone who would say the same things Travers had said, in the same way, confirming the story. That way, if Travers ever claimed he was lying or pressured, there would be another voice backing it up. So police turned to Michael Murdoch, the youngest of the 5. They figured he might be the most vulnerable, maybe the easiest to reach. Maybe he'd trust authority more. And since Travers' aunt had already been successful once, they asked her if she'd do it again. She agreed. They wired her up, and this time she went to Michael Murdoch's house. She played it cool casual just like before. Started talking to him about Anita. Said, "Look, Travers told me everything. I know what happened. I know what you all did. At first, Michael denied it, said he didn't know what she was talking about. Kept brushing it off. I don't know anything about Anita Cobby. But as the conversation went on, he started to slip. He let things out, bits and pieces. And while he didn't go into as much detail as Travers had, he did say enough to confirm the story. Enough that police could match what he said to Travers' confession. And that was all they needed. Now, police had 2 confessions, 2 matching stories. That was strong enough to go to court and more than strong enough to start making arrests. So they did. Officers moved quickly, going to each of the men's homes and bringing them in. Most of the group went without a fight, quiet, compliant. But Gary Murphy, he tried to run. He and Mick Murphy were found in the same house. When police entered, Mick surrendered calm. But Gary, as soon as he saw the officers, he bolted. Took off out the back door, across the garden, trying to escape into the dark. But there was no way out. The house was surrounded. Police knew how dangerous these men were. They weren't taking chances. And Gary only made it to the edge of the yard before he was tackled, handcuffed, and arrested. And when they caught him, he peed himself. This grown man, 28 years old, was so terrified, so shaken, that he lost control right then and there. And yes, there's photographic evidence. Pictures of him handcuffed, soaked in his own urine, now part of the case file forever. So that was it. All 5 men, John Travers, Michael Murdoch, Leslie Murphy, Gary Murphy, and Mick Murphy, were formally charged with kidnapping, with rape, and with the murder of Anita Cobby. As the case moved toward trial, there was one detail that deserved to be acknowledged. John Travers' aunt, the woman who had helped police get those confessions, ended up paying a heavy price for her bravery. Because of her role in exposing her nephew, she and her entire family had to enter the witness protection program. John Travers had a lot of dangerous connections, people who weren't exactly thrilled that one of his own had helped put him behind bars. She received death threats, anonymous messages, and even texts that revealed her exact location at times. It became clear that she wasn't safe, so the government stepped in. She was given a new identity, a new home. Her family relocated too. They started a completely different life, far away from everything they once knew, all because she had the courage to do the right thing. Now, back to the trial. In court, for the very first time, police and prosecutors were able to lay out the complete timeline of what had happened to Anita Cobby. Until this point, even the public didn't know everything. The full picture had only come together after those confessions were made. Once the men started talking, and the investigation filled in the gaps, police could finally reconstruct the nightmare that unfolded on the night Anita was taken and murdered. And what they discovered was worse than anyone could have imagined. So, like I said, Anita Cobby safely arrived at Blacktown train station that night around 10 p.m. She tried to call her father to pick her up, just like she usually did. But every payphone in the station was out of order. All of them had been vandalized. So, with no other options, she walked over to the taxi rank, but there were no taxis there either. So Anita, probably thinking it was no big deal, decided to walk home. It wasn't far. Just a 20-minute walk, a route she knew well. About 10 minutes into her walk, she was making her way down a quiet road when a car passed her and pulled over just up ahead. Maybe she didn't think anything of it. People park on streets all the time. Maybe she figured it was just someone pulling in at home, so she kept walking toward it. But as she got closer, 2 men jumped out. We now know that those 2 men were John Travers and Michael Murdoch. They grabbed Anita. She started screaming as loud as she possibly could, trying to alert someone, anyone, nearby. It was a desperate scream. A scream that some people did hear, but didn't understand the danger in time. The men shoved Anita into the back seat of the car. Once she was inside, at least one of them sat on top of her, pinning her down, flattening her against the seat. 1, so she couldn't escape, and 2, so no one outside the car could see her. Then, the car made a U-turn and drove back the way it came. Now, from this point on, things get blurry. There were 5 men in the car that night. And while some parts of what happened next are clear, specific, horrifying details that came out later, the exact order of events is harder to pin down. Because these men were drunk, completely intoxicated, and what they did to Anita went on for hours. They tortured her for hours. And when it came time to explain it, they couldn't remember the order. Because to them, it all just blurred into one horrific, prolonged attack. So now with Anita trapped in the back of their car, the men just drove aimlessly, without a real plan, just circling around the area with her in the back seat, terrified and helpless. At some point, some of the men began demanding that Anita take off all her clothes. She cried. She begged them not to do this. Over and over again, she pleaded, "Please, just let me go." She told them she was married. She told them she was on her period, trying desperately to appeal to anything that might make them stop. But they didn't care. They ordered her to strip, and she did. As they continued to drive, they would stop intermittently to beat her. There didn't seem to be a reason or a pattern. It was just violence for violence's sake, as if they were taking turns hurting her randomly without thought. This is believed to be when Anita's nose and both of her cheekbones were broken, and then one by one, each of the 5 men forced Anita to perform oral sex. They literally swapped seats as they took turns. Whoever wasn't driving would climb into the back with her. And this went on for about an hour and a half. Just imagine that, trapped in a moving car, surrounded by monsters. No help, no escape, and every time you beg them to stop, they just laugh. Eventually, the car started running low on gas, so they pulled into a gas station with Anita still in the back seat, naked, bloodied, broken. No one noticed. It was late at night. It was dark. Maybe that explains it. But still, she was right there. The men stole money from her purse and used it to pay for their gas. They used her own money to fuel the rest of her nightmare. And from there, they drove to the place where Anita's body would eventually be found in the field. But the abuse didn't stop there. The whole way to the farm, she was beaten and raped repeatedly. Different members of the group, one after another, over and over, and always at knife point. She must have been so scared. When they finally reached the farm, they told Anita to get out of the car and climb over the fence into the field, but she couldn't. She was so badly beaten, she couldn't even walk. So they dragged her from the car. They forced her through a barbed wire fence. They pushed her body through the thorns. Many of the injuries found during her autopsy, deep lacerations, abrasions were believed to have come from this barbed wire. And once they got her into that field, they kept going. They continued the attack just as they had in the car. Only now, they didn't need to move. They stayed in one place and took turns, over and over, all 5 of them. At one point during the horrific attack in the field, the men said they heard a car approaching. It was driving slowly up the lane just beside the field. In a panic, they all dropped to the ground, ducking down into the grass. They grabbed Anita, covered her mouth, not that she could scream anymore. By that point, she barely had the strength to make a sound. They lay there, still and silent, as the person in the car got out. They heard footsteps, saw the beam of a flashlight scanning the field, and then nothing. The person got back into the car and drove away. Whoever they were, they hadn't seen anything. But now knowing what we know, it's devastating. Because that car, it belonged to the people who had witnessed the kidnapping earlier that night. They were out there trying to find Anita, trying to retrace the route. They were so close. Had they stepped just a few feet into that field, they would have found her. Though, to be fair, it was probably too dangerous. Had they approached, they might have been attacked themselves. But still, they were right there. Instead, the attackers got away with it, at least, for the moment. And so they continued. The torture went on for at least another hour. Around this time, John Travers started to sober up. But let's be clear, he wasn't remorseful. He wasn't feeling guilt or compassion. He was feeling fear. He realized how much trouble they were in. If Anita survived, if she made it to a hospital, she would be able to name every single one of them. She'd seen their faces, heard them call each other by name, She knew who they were. So, in his mind, there was only one option. She couldn't be allowed to live. Travers began convincing the others that they had to kill her. And chillingly, it didn't take much convincing. They all agreed, but none of them wanted to be the one to do it. So they pushed it back on Travers. It was your idea, they said. You do it. One of them even said, go do your thing. So John Travers walked over to Anita Cobby, and he slit her throat, so deeply that she was almost decapitated. Then the men ran. They got back in the car and drove away, leaving her, alone, in the cold, in the dark. It's believed that it took about 2 minutes from the time Travers slit her throat to the moment Anita finally passed away. 2 long, excruciating minutes. Lying there, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading, and then silence, just darkness and death. After the murder, the men drove out to some isolated field. There, they burned their clothes, all of them, except for John Travers. For some reason, Travers refused. He told the others that he didn't want to burn his clothes. And now, knowing what we know, it's clear why. Those clothes were covered in Anita's blood, and he didn't want to get rid of them. He wanted to keep them as some kind of sick, twisted trophy. That's also why he never washed them even 2 weeks after the murder. He let them sit, stained and untouched. The stolen car ended up with Michael Murdoch, but no one really knows where it went. Police never actually found it. And that tragically was the full timeline of what happened to Anita Cobby that night. When the jury heard everything, the confessions, the injuries, the sequence of events, the entire truth, there was no doubt in their minds. These men were guilty of everything. And the jury found all 5 of them guilty of all charges. The public's reaction was overwhelming. There was desperation in the community. People wanted capital punishment, the death penalty for each of them. They felt that no other sentence would be enough. Outside the courthouse, angry mobs gathered every single day. People brought signs that read, "We want them dead." At one point, they even made a dummy of one of the men and hung it from a building, like a warning. But the law was the law. And at that time, in New South Wales, the death penalty had been abolished. It wasn't even an option anymore. So instead, the court handed down the harshest sentence available. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. They would die behind bars. This case didn't just rock Sydney. It shook the entire country. The horror of what had happened to Anita Cobby united people across Australia in grief, in anger, and in a desperate cry for justice. But through it all, Anita's family chose a different path. They didn't want to be consumed by hate. They didn't want to let anger rot their lives the way these men had destroyed Anita's N6. Her mother, Grace, didn't call it forgiveness, and she was very clear about that. She said she didn't forgive Anita's killers, not for a second. But she also refused to let anger define her life. She wouldn't let these men take any more than they already had. And instead of staying in the darkness, she decided to take what happened to Anita, this unimaginable tragedy, and try to turn it into something good. Anita's family made a decision. When they remembered her, they didn't want the next thought in their mind to be about hate. They didn't want their memories of Anita to be followed by rage toward her killers. They just wanted to remember her, the good times, the laughter, the way she lit up a room. They wanted to honor her memory, not see her only as a murder victim. If anything, they hoped that Anita's legacy, her life, and even her tragedy could go on to help others, to educate people, to keep other women safe. Because the truth is, Anita couldn't have done anything differently that night. The payphones weren't working. There were no taxis at the rank. She didn't have another way home. She was doing what most of us would do in that moment, just trying to get home. But her family wanted to raise awareness, especially among young women, that walking home alone at night, even when it feels safe, even when it's just around the corner, can sometimes go very wrong. They campaigned to remind people, if there's a payphone, use it. If you can call a ride, do it. If you have options, choose the safest one. They wanted Anita's story to be a lesson. Not a warning filled with fear, but a chance to prevent something like this from happening again. Every member of Anita's family struggled to come to terms with what had happened to her, but no one more than John Cobby. Like I said, He spiraled into addiction, alcohol, heroin, anything to numb the pain, and even years later, he still carries it all with him. He says that sometimes he visits a small church where there's a plaque on the wall in memory of Anita. He'll sit there for hours just talking to her. He tells her about his life, asks for guidance, talks about his kids, because yes, he has children now, and he believes Anita answers him, not with words, but through his dreams. He says he has a recurring dream about her, a dream where he has to save her. Each time, it's a different scenario, but always the same feeling he has to rescue her. And he thinks it's his brain's way of coping, a way to give him what real life never did, another chance, a chance to finally save her, to do what he couldn't do that night, to try, even just in sleep, to make it right. I mentioned earlier that John Cobby fell deep into addiction after Anita's death, and thankfully, he did manage to climb out of it. But life didn't suddenly get easier. He spent years in and out of psychiatric hospitals trying to manage his trauma. He was left with severe mental health issues, the kind that don't just fade with time. For years, he couldn't even bring himself to date. The guilt was overwhelming. Every moment he spent with another woman felt like a betrayal. Every place he visited reminded him of Anita, the restaurants they went to, the cities they traveled to. It all felt too raw. But eventually, he met someone new, a woman who would become his wife. He built a family with her, had children, but not before making one big change. He changed his name, because being John Cobby was unbearable. The name alone was a trigger. Every time someone heard it, they asked questions. They brought up Anita. He couldn't introduce himself without the past following him into the room. So he became John Francis. And for a while, that helped. It gave him space, privacy, anonymity. He could just exist without the weight of that name pressing down on him. But as his children grew up into teenagers, into young adults, he realized something. All those years, he'd just been running from the pain, from the guilt, from his past. Changing his name hadn't erased it, it had only buried it. So, with the support of his son, he made the decision to go back, to stop hiding. Together, they went to change their names back to Cobby. For his son, the change was symbolic. He'd been Francis his whole life. He didn't need to go back, but he did it anyway. For his dad, to stand beside him, to help him reclaim that part of his life, not to erase it, but to finally face it. Because the only way through pain like that is through it. Now, just a few updates on the killers. In 1996, John Travers actually tried to escape prison. He and another inmate began faking a serious illness. It's unclear what exactly they claimed to have, but they played it well enough that the prison eventually agreed to send them both to a hospital. So the two men were loaded into a transport van, supposedly for medical treatment. But once they were inside the van, they pulled out Hacksaw's tools they'd stolen from the prison workshop and started sawing through the back door of the vehicle. The plan, as ridiculous as it sounds, was to cut open a hole in the back of the van, jump out, and go on the run. But of course, this wasn't a cartoon. The officers driving the van heard the sawing, realized something was wrong, pulled over immediately, and found the two of them mid-escape attempt. They were rearrested on the spot, handcuffed, and taken straight back to prison with additional charges for the escape attempt. Not that it made much difference. They were already serving life without parole. But it does show you just how desperate and delusional Travers still was. And here's something else. John Travers was so hated in prison that he had to be placed in protective custody. Other inmates constantly tried to attack him, even kill him, because everyone in that facility knew what he'd done. They knew the name Anita Cobby. They knew who he was, and they wanted revenge. The same thing happened to Mick Murphy. He too spent much of his sentence in protective custody. But in his case, it wasn't just about who he was. It was about something that happened inside the prison, something that made him a target even among some of the most dangerous men behind bars. In prison, Mick Murphy suffered one of the most disturbing assaults of all. Other inmates managed to pin him down. One of them pulled his pants down, inserted a tube into his body, and then slid barbed wire through that tube. Once the barbed wire was fully inside, they yanked the tube back out, leaving only the barbed wire behind. The injuries were so severe, Mick couldn't sit down for weeks. Even during his next court hearing, he was forced to stand the entire time. The pain was just too much. And honestly, that wasn't a rare event. All 5 of the men involved in Anita Cobby's murder were regularly beaten in prison. They were hated. No one forgot what they'd done. And in places like prison, that kind of crime marks you forever. It became a yearly thing for these men to end up in the hospital. Gary Murphy, for example, was once attacked in the shower block. He was beaten so badly, he sustained serious head injuries and had to be rushed to the hospital. In 2019, Mick Murphy passed away in prison. He had terminal cancer and died at the age of 66 after serving 33 years behind bars. Half of his life was spent in a cell, dying there just like he was sentenced to. Anita's parents, Gary and Grace Lynch, have also passed away since then. But in their lifetime, they did so much in Anita's memory. They never stayed silent. They never sat still. They chose to take their grief, their unimaginable loss, and turn it into action. They partnered with other parents who had also lost children to violence. Together, they created the Homicide Victim Support Group, a safe space, yes, but also a powerful voice. This group doesn't just offer emotional support, although that is its heart. They also campaign. They fight for stricter laws. They push for tougher sentences, all inspired by what happened to Anita. Because no family should ever have to live through what they did.